members of the proposition, fellow members of the opposition, adjudicators, timekeepers, and members of the House. My name is Denny, and my colleague Ross and I are here today to oppose the motion that we should abolish the minimum wage. During the course of my speech, I will discuss the fundamental idea of the minimum wage and how it protects unskilled workers from exploitation. Then I'll take a brief look at how the minimum wage actually stimulates the economy and acts as an incentive for those who are unemployed to seek work. Finally, I'll discuss how unfeasible it would be to abolish the minimum wage, especially in the current economic climate. My colleague Ross will then go on to expand upon these points as well as to sum up the debate as a whole. Firstly, what is the minimum wage? The minimum wage is the lowest rate which an employer can legally pay an employee. At the moment, that's €7.65 an hour. Many countries don't have a reasonable minimum wage. For example, in Germany, there's none. And if you're a hairdresser working in central Germany, you can expect to earn €3.18 an hour. Some countries which do have a minimum wage have it set far too low. If you're a worker working in Guangdong province in China, you can expect to earn 29 cents an hour. I'd like to now offer a bit of rebuttal to First Prop, who said it was too expensive to invest or to have a business in Ireland, and that we should abolish the minimum wage because saving some income for low-income earners isn't enough of a reason. Firstly, I'd like to say that's a very heartless argument. But more importantly, a minimum wage, when it's reasonable, doesn't stop foreign investment, as long as it is reasonable. We've seen this, and Ireland has massive foreign investment. It still does, greater than most other countries. Also, I'd like to point out that following the introduction of the minimum wage in Ireland, the industrial wage actually jumped by 7%, while unemployment did actually drop, so it did something. And when there's no reasonable minimum wage, all wages are dictated by supply and demand, as the proposition has pointed out. But it's not simply a perfect balance, where employers pay fairly for work. For more skilled jobs such as doctors, there's a limited supply of labour, so doctors get paid a reasonable wage. For unskilled labour, however, there's an unlimited supply. It's only limited by the population, and for this reason, employers can decide on an unfair wage. If you don't like it, there are 441,193 other unemployed people in Ireland who will take your job. Employers can exploit unpaid, unskilled workers, and if you're a lonely hairdresser working in central Germany, or if you're a kid who left school early in China to go make shoes for a living, you know that way too well. No thank you. What a reasonable minimum wage does is it protects these people from exploitation. In the 1980s, unemployment was even higher than it is now, and there was no minimum wage. Instead of hiring lots of people at low wages, employers hired very few people at low wages. People even worked below the level of social welfare. I'd like to make that very clear to the proposition. They worked below the level of social welfare. That's how much they were being exploited. But they still worked, because they didn't want to depend on the system. They wanted to be their own breadwinners. No thank you. They wanted to be independent, and for that they were punished, earning less than someone who doesn't work at all. Having a minimum wage protects these people and it rewards them, if only a little bit, by providing them with an incentive to work, by making it financially viable for them to work. Not only does it protect them, but it can also boost the economy, which is what I look at now. No thank you. The minimum wage gives low-income earners more disposable income. It increases tax revenues and boosts business. They'll put their money back into the economy, as opposed to letting that money fill up the accounts of fat businessmen. At the same time, the minimum wage creates an incentive for those who are unemployed to seek work. When wages are a healthy level above that of social welfare, then there's more competition for work. Those who are on the long-term unemployed list have more of a reason to come off the live register and seek work. In Ireland, far less of our unemployed are on the long-term unemployed list than, say, Germany, where there's no minimum wage, and 50% of their unemployed, yes?
And would you like to compare and contrast the German and Irish economies right now and tell us the minimum wage is a source of economic stimulation?
I'd like to say that the minimum wage is a source of economic stimulation, because we currently have a higher GDP per capita, per head of population than Germany, which is supposedly the powerhouse of Europe. For our population, we're punching way above our weight, and we have a minimum wage. At the same time, it creates an incentive for people to seek work, as I've said. In Ireland, we do have far less on the long-term unemployed list. Also, a minimum wage doesn't create unemployment as long as it's reasonable. The minimum wage being €10 an hour or €100 an hour would cause unemployment. Nobody would be hired to do unskilled jobs because it wouldn't be economically profitable. This isn't the case, however, when the minimum wage is reasonable. It leaves businesses with enough profit to continue. If they can't afford it in Ireland, they can seek an exemption from the labour court until such time as they can. It's a balance, and countless studies have supported this. Yes?
You do realise that exemption lasts for a maximum of 1 year. What if the company can't get back?
If the company can't resume paying minimum wage after 1 year, they obviously aren't viable enough as a business to support their workers and offer them a reasonable standard of living, so that business shouldn't continue. It's an accepted factor in the economics that when there's a reasonable minimum wage, it means that workers will just be paid reasonably without unemployment. If we abolish the minimum wage, we'd see the same unemployment, but with the employers exploiting their employees and pocketing the difference. These businessmen wouldn't be just fat cats, they'd be morbidly obese cats, while the low-end workers would be struggling to survive. But this debate isn't just about having a minimum wage. It's about abolishing one when it's already in place. And that's what I look at now. Say we abolish the minimum wage in Ireland. What would happen? For starters, the 60,000 people in Ireland who currently depend on the minimum wage for a reasonable income would find their pay cut dramatically. At the same time, inflation would continue because it's only 60,000 out of the population. We would continue to have a high cost of living. Many of these 60,000 people would lose their jobs to young people who aren't entitled to social welfare and will happily work below the minimum wage. Well, thank you. My brother is 18. Because he still hasn't bothered to move out of the house, he isn't entitled to social welfare. He'll happily work for €3 an hour and cost a fully grown man or woman their job, which supported a family and paid a mortgage. By abolishing the minimum wage, you're telling these people, these Irish men and women, that we don't care, that they're here to be exploited. Well, thank you. We're sending a clear statement that this is not a fair society, and that even though 2/3 of our democratic citizens support a minimum wage, we're going to deny them the right to govern themselves, because we're going to protect the elite. Furthermore, we're encouraging these citizens to emigrate to a country where they will be valued, and that's not going to benefit our country. That's not going to support our economy. It's very easy for us here in UCC to say that abolishing the minimum wage would help, because we're not earning minimum wage. We don't know what it's like. It's almost an involuntary reflex to assume that it'll solve our problems, but as you've heard, for various reasons, it won't. It's because of this that many countries that don't have a minimum wage are planning on introducing one, such as Germany. So in all of these countries, why would we want to be taking a step back? To conclude, you've heard how the minimum wage protects unskilled workers from being exploited, which Ross will look at in a lot more detail later. You've heard that the minimum wage stimulates the economy in certain cases without causing unemployment, and you've heard how dangerous it would be to abolish the minimum wage in Ireland, especially right now. I can't urge you strongly enough to oppose this motion, and if you're still not convinced, consider this. 60,000 people currently in Ireland are earning the minimum wage. 240,000 Irish people can't pay their basic utility bills who are working, not on social welfare. Try telling them, the people who know full well, firsthand, what it feels like to subsist. The people who are trying to survive, tell them you're going to remove their last lifeline, and tell them that we don't care. Tell them you're abolishing the minimum wage to make the rich even richer, because we don't have to. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have a government in this country. The role of this government is to protect its citizens. It provides a police force, a justice system, a social welfare system, all of which cater for basic needs like shelter and security. In the year 2000, the government introduced the minimum wage. The idea seems to have been to protect the so-called working poor by ensuring that they would always have an adequate income to live on, as Charlotte said, to provide a social floor. This is of course a very noble idea, and it is completely understandable that in the heat of the moment, carried away by the nobility of their intentions, the government would forget that they already had unemployment benefit to ensure a minimum living standard. But 10 years later, it's time to call an end to the minimum wage. An unnecessary, supposedly noble market intervention that benefits no one when, as Joe said, we already have a good social welfare system, and it actually causes a lot of damage to the economy. First, let's pretend that we're all still happily living in a growing economy. The economy grows, put simply, when demand is greater than supply. New companies start up in order to fill the demand, creating more jobs. This means that the companies are competing for employees. They attract the employees by offering them a higher wage than their competitors. Introducing a minimum wage into a situation is pointless. If an employer wants workers, which presumably they all do since our robots aren't quite up to scratch yet, they need to pay more than the dole does, or nobody will be willing to work for them.
On that point,
yes?
you don't think there's such a big pressure in our society to work? The fact that we judge people by the work they do, you think people would rather work 10 hours than do?
I don't think so, no, because when people are working and being paid, I don't think there is, no, because if you're being paid a lower wage than you can be paid otherwise, why would you take that wage when you need to support your family or anything like that situation? No, thank you. Yes. So, apart from this being unnecessary, a set minimum wage also has an adverse effect in this situation. Say, for instance, that all restaurant owners get together and decide they will only pay X euro an hour to all their waiters, despite rising profits. The waiters are understandably angry about this, because they too want to profit from the expanding economy and the diners' expanding waistlines. But if X euro an hour is still more than the legal minimum wage, there's little they can protest about. In this case, the government, instead of protecting the ordinary citizen, has inadvertently protected the increasing profits of the companies. Instead of a minimum wage, the wages would have been far better served by government support for union activity and laws against cartels. This, Donny, is the system in Germany, where there is no minimum wage. It's not that they are cold-hearted, no thank you, and cruel to hairdressers. It's that they realise that this is a better way to protect their employees. The government could, of course, counteract the problem of employers unfairly profiting from their employees by revising up the minimum wage. However, just the idea of a rising minimum wage will raise protests from employers, which will have negative political consequences for the government and may even lead some multinational companies to relocate to cheaper countries, as Michael already said. It also perpetuates, the existence of a class of workers who sit on the bottom rung of the ladder, doing the minimum amount of work for the minimum wage. Their motivation to improve their performance and thus improve their wage is taken away because their wage is raised automatically for them. This leads some workers to become stuck in a psychological low-wage trap, having no impetus to develop their skills, and creates a drag on the economy as a whole. Yes?
Surely earning €3.80 an hour in Germany, which is the situation, even though it's unionised, would be a lot worse. They wouldn't be able to benefit themselves because they're not earning enough money. They are only subsisting.
Well, so what you have to realise about Germany and Ireland, there is a difference both in the wages that we pay, but also in the cost of things. So Ireland actually has very high costs, as people were mentioned. The living cost is very high, so we need to have a higher basic wage than Germany does because they can't afford. They think they can spend the same amount of money to buy, or it's a lower amount of money to buy the same amount of things in Germany. And of course, the economy can't grow forever. Joe mentioned that is inherent in the cyclical nature of an economy, that eventually it outgrows itself, and supply outstrips demand in one or more sectors. For example, our current recession was caused because after a while everyone already had a house and there was no need to continue building them, so the property sector collapsed. When a large section of the economy collapses, a lot of people lose their jobs and the labour market is flooded with the newly unemployed. Ideally, what happens next is that the companies that are struggling can drop wages dramatically because there are so many unemployed people that they are willing to accept even a low-paying job. These companies can then produce things more cheaply so people can buy more for less money and the economy begins to grow again. However, a minimum wage stops companies from reducing costs in this way. If they are forced to try to pay a wage which they can't afford, they will eventually have to lay off employees or close altogether, adding to unemployment and prolonging the recession. If this is the case, for several companies over a long period of time, saying that after 1 year those companies should all close isn't a practical solution, as Doherty suggested. The other option the company has is to employ people on the black market for less than minimum wage. This is disastrous for an employee because it means they have no legal protection, no insurance, and no unionism. The James Connolly kind, not the Ian Payson kind. Well, then you revise down the minimum wage, cried the exasperated opposition. But this begs the question, if you're going to continuously revise the minimum wage up and down, depending on the state of the market, isn't that just admitting that the market sets its own minimum wage? In any case, revising the minimum wage down is a lot easier said than done. No government wants to take an action that is so obviously going to hurt people's pockets in the short term, because of the political consequences of telling people the truth that they don't want to hear. Thus, by the time the government either convinces the people of a need for a lower minimum wage, or realises that they're going to lose the election anyway and they may as well do it, we're 2 years into the recession and it's a case of too little, too late. Unfortunately, in a recession, the harsh reality is that everyone's wages take a hit. It is a noble sentiment to suggest that only those earning over €100,000 salaries should take pay cuts. But this is impractical. There simply aren't that many people in this bracket. Yes?
Exactly, so you're going to go and attack the weakest in society, those who are earning least money.
I take an objection to the use of the word attack, because the reality is that in a recession, everyone has to suffer, including the lowest income earners. And this is why social welfare is so vitally important, because the government must step in and protect its citizens by giving them a subsistence income in the form of the dole, rather than insisting that private companies do so by paying a minimum wage that they actually can't afford. However, the government does have a limited treasury and cannot support a huge number of people on the dole forever. Therefore, it's essential that the economy bounces back quickly from a recession. And the best way to bring a quick recovery is allow the market to do it itself, as described above. Imposing a minimum wage is only going to delay the process. The economy can only ever be growing or shrinking. A so-called stable economy is one in which the economy grows and contracts slowly and with less severity than those of other countries. This is achieved in countries like Canada by having high tax, which allows for high social welfare payments, thus slowing the growth of the economy and also ensuring that the government has plenty of money to pay social welfare during recessions, which means that the arguments I've already aligned against the minimum wage still hold true. In a recession, the minimum wage can have disastrous consequences. In a boom time, it's unnecessary and can also cause problems for society and the economy. Its purported function is to protect the lowest paid citizens from stingy employers and the hardships of a shrinking economy. This it cannot do. According to Shakespeare, all the world's a stage. In the great play of life, the part the minimum wage wants is already taken by social welfare, which does a much better job of it. It's time to pull curtains on the minimum wage. Ladies and gentlemen, I beg to propose.